All right, class, are you ready for another fun phylum of worms? This is Phylum Nematoda, and this is the roundworm phyla. Yes, there are more parasites. Actually, the majority of them are going to be parasitic, and I will warn you, some of the images that I show you, and they're also in your note packet, are quite graphic. So I'll try and warn you before we get to them, but I may not remember to. So be prepared. So we're looking at our timeline of evolutionary history, and nematodes are just a little bit more advanced than the flatworms, the platyhelminthes. And then it branches off. On the left are Echinodermata, those would be like the sea stars, and Chordata. We are examples of Chordata. And then off to the right, annelids are like earthworms and leeches. Then mollusks are going to be clams and squid, and then we have arthropods, which are all the insects and crustaceans. So you can see kind of where we're at as far as evolutionary developments. Like I said, I'm warning you now, some of the pictures are very gross. These guys are nasty parasites, and they cause major problems for humans and for all different species of animals. So there are about 12,000 species known of nematodes. The phylum Nematoda are known as roundworms, as I said before. There's probably about 500,000 other species out there. We just haven't discovered them all. They have a cylindrical body, and they only have longitudinal muscles in their bodies. If you remember, the planarians had circular muscles as well to help them with their movements. A non-cellular cuticle will help protect them. The roundworms are some of the most abundant animals on Earth. There are 5 billion worms possibly in every acre of fertile garden soil. And we're not talking earthworms. They play an important role in recycling nutrients in soils and sediments. This does, obviously earthworms are included in this role as well. Most of these roundworms are microscopic, but some are over a meter long. They can be found everywhere. They can be found in soil, oceans, polar ice even, hot springs. They can be parasites of nearly all plant and animal species, so they're very diverse in their hosts. And the free-living roundworms are usually carnivorous. So for their body cavities, they are pseudocoelomates, so they have that false body cavity. That round layer is just one layer of mesoderm around their coelom. So like I said, they're not completely lined. It allows their organs to function without being interrupted by the surrounding tissue. And their pseudocoelom aids in circulation, digestion, and acts as a hydrostatic skeleton. So it gives them a little internal structure without having bones. They are the simplest animals to have a digestive system with two openings, a mouth and an anus. So this is the first major evolutionary change in organisms to have a one-way digestive tract. They breathe and excrete their waste through their body wall by diffusion, so they still use diffusion for that. And they have a simple nervous system consisting of several ganglia or groups of nerve cells in the head region, so they sort of have a rudimentary brain. And they also have several sense organs that are used to detect chemicals in their environment. For digestion, like I said, they're the first ones to have a one-way digestive system. They have a pharynx for feeding, and the pharynx is something that they can kind of protrude out of their mouth to grasp whatever food it is that they're trying to get. For circulation, they can move fluids through their body cavity, through their pseudocoelom, and it helps with circulating their different gases and for gas exchange. They have oxygen and carbon dioxide move in and out of this fluid through diffusion. And for movement, the rigid body offers resistance for their contracting muscles, and then they kind of have the wriggling motion from that. For excretion, they do depend on diffusion to get rid of their wastes. They use something called protonephridia for osmoregulation in fresh water. So they kind of function as kidneys, sort of, to help make sure that they have the right water balance in their bodies. They do go through a molting process. Some species have a thin, tough external cuticle, and in order to grow, they have to molt this outside layer. Here's some basic anatomy of any nematode. They have the mouth and pharynx, and this we're starting at the left side at the top. They do have a very rudimentary intestine. They have their they do typically have separate sexes. So the top one is a female and the second worm is a male. So they'll have, they're not hermaphroditic. They have separate male and female sexes in these guys. So you can follow that through, and then they both do have an anus. You can see in the cross section where they have a dorsal nerve and a ventral nerve, and then they have their muscle layer is going to be the longitudinal. Reproduction. Most nematodes are either male or female, like I said, not hermaphroditic. Fertilization takes place when the males use a special copulatory spine to open the female's reproductive tract and inject sperm into them. The sperm are unique in that they lack flagella and they move by pseudopods like a big amoeba, so they kind of are little blob-looking sperm. Here is how you would be able to tell the difference in the sexes. The lower one is the male, and they typically have this little curve on their end of their tail. I do have roundworm. I think I just have one roundworm in a preservative that I got from the vet hospital, and I'll have to pass that around and see if you guys can figure out if it's a male or female roundworm. But then you can see in the top, now their ovary and their testes do not hang on the outside of their body. They're just kind of stretching it out for you in this diagram so that you can see what it looks like. All right, some different types of roundworms. ASCARIS are going to be tapered at both ends. These are the typical roundworms that your dog or cat might have. There are hookworms. They can bore through your feet. So if you're walking around barefoot outside, it could happen to you. That's what their head looks like, and they don't look very nice, do they? Then there's another one, Trichinella. They create cysts in meat, and then if you eat that meat and it's undercooked, those cysts break open, and then you get infected with the roundworm. And there's an image of one of the Trichinella worms. Pinworms, these are fun ones. Just you wait and see here. This causes intense itching in the host and makes the host scratch. Here's a little pinworm. They are pretty small too when you're looking at them under the microscope. And there are filarial worms. These are usually the type that are transmitted by mosquitoes. So heartworm in dogs and cats is a type of filarial worm. And well, I'll leave it at that. I have pictures to show you later. Here's an image. These guys are very, very small because they live in, they travel through the bloodstream, so they have to be pretty small to fit through blood vessels. And then we have C. elegans is the nickname for these. Let's see, Caenorhabditis. I'm not very good at some of these names. I typically only have to pronounce them once a year. These are not the names that I walk around using in my regular everyday language. They are a free-living nematode. They have something called utli, and this means they have a constant number of cells. And I find this very amazing that they can have the same number of cells all the time. I mean, if you think about your skin cells are constantly coming off and recycling themselves, but this particular worm has a constant number of cells, and I don't know who actually sat down and counted them all, and a lot of worms, I'm sure, to get that sort of data, but they have that information recorded. They have exactly 959 cells. Pretty amazing to me. And the way that each of these cells develops is known. There's been a lot of research on this type of worm, and I know you're probably thinking, why in the world would someone want to sit there and study worms? Well, if they know how these cells develop, then they can probably extrapolate into other species, including humans. And that's where a lot of the stem cell research comes from too, is knowing how cells in this type of worm can develop and figuring out how different cells in humans can develop. They were the first genome that was sequenced in all of the animal world. They are the first multicellular eukaryote that they were able to figure out where the location of every single gene was and what it controlled. This guy actually won the Nobel Prize for studying them. His name is Sidney Brenner. He's done many other things, but he won a Nobel Prize for this. He had started studying them in 1963. And there's some other scientists that he worked with that were also awarded the Nobel Prize in 2002. That's a lot of years of your life to dedicate to studying worms. So I think he deserves a prize for that hard work. All right, going into specific worms now. ASCARIS. There's a nice little pile of roundworms. A lot of times they actually get vomited up in a big pile like this. It's lovely. Let me tell you, working in the animal hospital, I've seen some interesting things. But they can infect humans. The adult worm lives in the intestine where it produces eggs, and they leave the body in the feces. If food or water is contaminated with feces that have the eggs in them, the eggs can then hatch in the new person or new host and infect them. The young worms, so let's say you eat lettuce that had fecal material with these ascarid worm eggs in them. You eat the salad because the person at the grocery store didn't wash their hands, and these eggs get in your intestines. The young worms, the larval worms, will hatch out, burrow into the walls of your intestine, and get into your bloodstream. They can then travel around and get into your lungs. Then, here, they get out of the bloodstream. They kind of burrow through your alveoli into your actual lung cavity. They can climb up your throat, and then they get swallowed back down into your intestines where they become an adult worm. Sounds like fun, right? So the roundworm of man, the females can grow up to a foot long and produce 200,000 eggs a day. A day. That's a lot of eggs. Humans become infected when they eat food or water that's contaminated with these eggs. It can infect about 1.2 billion people each year. Many of them are in the southeast U.S. I'm going to assume that there's less sanitation in that area. Here's an image of a roundworm. They are the most common worm infection worldwide. Mostly occurs in children, and if you imagine, children aren't as conscientious about what they put in their mouths as adults are, so they're the ones who are most likely going to get infected with roundworms. About 25% of the world's population is currently infected with roundworms. Whether they know it or not is a different story. Here's a nice little pile. And here, like I said, is the difference on the posterior end of the worm. Hopefully you remember what posterior means. you can see the difference between the males and the females. So they are considered dioecious because they do have two sexes. They have separate sexes. Here's the life cycle. There's a lot of life cycles for these parasites. We can start at the right-hand side, like at 3 o'clock, where the eggs are in the feces. They go through some cell division, and then they become infective when they get over to the 9 o'clock area. They're in the contaminated feces and they get ingested. Eggs hatch into larvae. They burrow and get into your bloodstream, to your lungs. You cough them up, or they just crawl up and you swallow them. And then they grow as adults in your small intestine. And they do have little attachment pieces in their head area so that they don't get swept away in the intestines. They just kind of hang out in there. Okay, pinworms. Enterobius vermicularis. These ones are fun, little pinworms. They are the most common parasitic infection in the United States, and you'll find out why. Typically, 1 in 5 children are infected with pinworms. Worldwide, about 500 million people are going to be infected with pinworms. And they can grow up to about a ½ inch long. Many of them are pretty small, though. Another image of a pinworm. Adult pinworms live in the intestine. Females will crawl out through the anus at night and lay 15,000 eggs per day on the skin. So surrounding the anal tissue, they lay their eggs. That causes intense itching, which causes the host to scratch. And yes, they're scratching their butt. Their eggs from the worm get under the fingernails and on the hands. Then they can't get spread back to that person or to others when things are touched. So here's the life cycle starting at 3 o'clock again. The egg is sitting on the perianal tissue around the anus. It goes through some development and becomes infective. Becomes an embryonated egg. They get ingested. The eggs hatch into larvae in the intestine. They penetrate and develop in the mucosa, or in the lining of the intestines. And then they can reproduce in the intestines. And then the female crawls out at night, lays her eggs, goes back in, and then it keeps going until you get treated for it. So children will frequently itch, not thinking about it, and that's how they easily can get infected and spread it. This is a picture of someone's anus with little larvae on it. This person has quite an infection going on. Medication does work, but a flashlight and a small spoon is also required. Sorry, I'll pause. You should probably pause the video right now to just go throw up or something, right?